Thank you so much, all three panelists, for really, really excellent and thought-provoking papers. I'm sure you notice the coherence of their positions, that militarism results from when people feel that they have no other means of addressing intolerable circumstances, and the greater their intolerability of the circumstances, the more likely people are to be drawn to fantastic, in the literal sense, visions of heroic, instantaneous winning. People want to win. They'll be so tired of winning, they'll ask us to stop winning. It becomes so terrific and so fantastic, and people seem to be drawn to it, not just in developing parts of the Middle East, but elsewhere. These are things we must be very cognizant of, and we must, as has been said, address the causes of these circumstances that draw people to fantastic winning, rather than just fighting the symptoms. And with that, I will open the floor to questions and comments from our wonderful audience. If you can just identify yourselves, your affiliation, and tell us to whom you are addressing the question. There are microphones up here if you want to come up to the microphone. Yes, thank you. Sorry, right there in the middle of the floor. Please.
Thank you. My name is Safi Hamid, and I'm with the Center for Egyptian-American Relations. I would like to thank everyone in the panel. Excellent presentations. But my question is to Dr. Aziz. Two aspects. First of all, thank you for that excellent analysis of the situation in Sinai. Two things. Would you like to add something about Ismail al-Iskandarani, the excellent investigative reporter who was the most knowledgeable about Sinai and ended up to be arrested when he went to Egypt to visit his ailing mother and thrown in jail until now. And the other thing, of course, is that we all know, who follow the situation in Egypt, that Sisi is willing to pay anything for getting legitimacy, being a leader of a military coup. He gave away the Nile water with the approval for Ethiopia to build the dam, which will block 40% or 50% of the water in Egypt. He gave Cyprus natural gas, and he gave now Saudi Arabia 2 strategic islands. With all of that, knowing that here in our United States, we are very pragmatic in dealing with situations like this. Do you think giving the Strait of Tiran to be now, to convert from Egyptian water to become almost or literally international waterway, would that be considered, or you think, from your reading about positions of US and Israel and all the European forces, could that be the first step to internationalize, for instance, Sinai, or changing the situation in Sinai? Thank you.
Please. Thank you. Yes, it's working.
So I discuss actually Ismail Iskandarani in the article. I didn't talk about the media blackout in my presentation due to time constraints, but there has been a very aggressive media blackout in Sinai that has been in place for over a year now. And one of the consequences of the way that it's implemented is not simply physically prohibiting journalists from entering Sinai, whether they're foreign journalists or Egyptian journalists, but it has also been very aggressive persecution and prosecution of journalists who continue to report on Sinai, which there are very few, if any, left. Oftentimes they do it now through telephone or Skype, and Ismail Iskandarani is a very tragic example of that, who had actually been self-exiled and came back to Egypt against the advice of many of his colleagues and family, but came back because his mother was very ill. And as soon as he landed in Sharm el-Sheikh, he landed in Sharm el-Sheikh thinking maybe he wouldn't then be on the military security radar, and then he wanted to just go to visit his mother. But of course, because he has been writing very detailed analysis of the security deterioration and the oppression of the residents, he has been targeted. So yes, he is currently in jail. One can only imagine the conditions under which he's in, and I think it is a case that should certainly warrant international attention, because he's just one of the many political prisoners in Egypt right now, and it's very tragic. With regard to the islands, which I know this supposed sale or discussion of a sale of these two islands to Saudi Arabia has been a huge issue in Egypt. I see it as part of kind of a broader problem, which is that Sisi, I don't think, is nearly as strong as he claims to be. So he tells his people that he's very strong, but I think that Sisi is like Mubarak and like Sadat and like many other authoritarian leaders in the Middle East and other authoritarian states are only as strong as their Western backers support them, only insofar as they support them. And it's not just the Western backers now, it's also the Gulf backers. So Saudi Arabia, the Emirates in particular, to some extent Kuwait, has been funding the Egyptian economy. It's been subsidizing 90 million people, which is unsustainable, both for Egypt and for the Gulf countries, particularly as oil prices have plummeted. So one doesn't know if this is effectively something he has to do and doesn't really have any say because he's so desperate for money, because the economy is in tatters. But I think ultimately, I don't think he makes decisions based on what he wants per se or what's in the best interest of Egypt. I think, unfortunately, Egypt is in a position now, and arguably it was even under Mubarak, where it is Israel, America, Saudi Arabia, and other backers, external backers of the authoritarian regime who have much more say, because ultimately the authoritarian wants to stay in power, and the authoritarian anywhere knows that by virtue of being an authoritarian, he does not have domestic legitimacy and domestic support. So that makes him much more susceptible and vulnerable to control by external patrons.
Thank you. There are two mics here, by the way. Dr. Ali, please.
Ali Ramadan Abu Zakuk, supporters of the 17th of February revolution in Libya, and happen to be the foreign minister of the National Salvation Government in Tripoli. I will ask the beautiful people who are on the podium to really question the role of the international organizations, i.e. the United Nations, in trying to suppress a revolution in Libya by forcing its own mandate on the country there on the prelim that this is a government of national accord, without even giving any consideration to the elected bodies in Libya, be it the National Congress or be it the House of Representatives. And the question is that the representative of the United Nations became almost like Mr. Bremer in Iraq, the ruler of the country, who is just representing there. How can we discuss and counter this kind of an action by the world organization? This is the question that is really bothering most of the Libyan intelligentsia that are supporting the revolution, that we found themselves that now the world community represented by the United Nations are supporting the counter-revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Another or?
Well, okay, I'll offer a comment based on my ignorance of Libya, but the common perception that many people have is very different from the one that you just articulated. That Libya has been in chaos since the toppling of Gaddafi. Finally, there is this moment of hope where the UN representative has brought together the relevant factions and have come up with this peace plan that could perhaps get Libya out of this chaotic situation that has led to the spread of al-Qaeda and can begin the formations of a unity government. That's the common perception that I have and many other people have. So your perception seems to be the exact opposite. This is a foreign imposition, another colonial moment. And so my question is just whose perception is more accurate? And what strikes me in what you just have to say is I'm questioning to what extent is your view representative of the Libyan people? Are you reflecting your own personal preferences here, or are there other Libyans who perhaps are placing hope in this UN-sponsored process that can perhaps get Libya out of the current chaos that it's in? So I don't claim to know what's happening, but those are my sort of gut instincts in terms of what you just said and what I see happening in Libya.
If I could just add a few comments, it is a very difficult situation to sort out. We do know that we had the elections finally in Libya after the colonel was toppled, and the country was not given sufficient time to consolidate after decades of authoritarian rule, and immediately external forces came in to establish and support an alternate governance that would not allow for sharing of Libya's enormous resources. The enormous resources of Libya have been a thorn in its side, in my humble opinion, in that there have always been vested interests from outside the country who are keen on controlling those resources, not so dissimilar from the case of Iran, as we've seen in previous decades. So we had the establishment in the eastern part of the country of an alternate government, but it spoke better English, to put it bluntly, and had more ears in Washington. And as a result, we had these counter narratives going, in which case, of course, to have the United Nations or similar organization come in and try to sort things out seemed to be a balancing act, but without taking into consideration the source of the alternate governments, competing governments, it's very, very difficult to get, I think, a balanced view. So our best hope at this point is for more scholars to be able to become better informed of the circumstances, so to better inform Western policy. And I don't mean Western policy influenced by outsiders who have vested interests, but Western policy informed by well-educated population who recognize that it's in the best interest of the global community worldwide to have popularly elected governments sharing resources rather than status quo by any other name continuing. Other comments about Libya? Very, very important topic, and thank you for bringing that up. Next comment from
Kamran Bukhari, Program on Extremism at George Washington University. My question is for Hassan. You talk about Hashd al-Shabi, and I know you have a background in civilian law enforcement. Can you briefly explain why is it that militia integration into state security architecture has not succeeded? So I'll give you an example. In 2003-2004, Badr, the Badr militia, the Badr brigade, was integrated into MOI. But Badr also still continued to exist as a militia despite the integration, and we saw them back in action, part of Hashd al-Shabi after ISIS took over Mosul. So what is the disconnect here? Why isn't it that we see a successful reintegration, disarming, demobilization of militias, and then, because you're giving them a job, they should have an incentive to take the job. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamran, for a very important question. I'm immediately thinking of examples from Sri Lanka, where similar things happen, also from Colombia, in post-conflict situations where you have to do something with those groups who are battle-hardened, who have seen blood, who understand how to use weapons, and there's no place for them in society. So it's a logical thing to expect or to think of policy options, because that's the only thing that they know. So the natural place or space for them is for such militants and armed groups after resolution of cases or once violence is over, is to take them towards, try to induct them into society through state security forces. So it's a logical thing to do. Why it has not worked before was because in case of Al-Badr, Iran was sponsoring them. And Iran, not only in that case specifically, wanted to control the Ministry of Interior in Iran, but also Ministry of Interior in Iraq, but also wanted to be a player in the field. So that had something to do with the way Iran looked at its extension. However, I would argue that such transitions can work successfully if there is rapid transformation. If we would allow such militias, if they are given a long time, they then learn how to raise funds, how to acquire weapons through different global sources, and then they are addicted to it. They don't want an official chain of command and a control by the state. Longer such groups retain their independence in the field, the difficult it becomes to incorporate them. That's why I was suggesting it. This is an appropriate time because to induct some of these forces into state forces, because this is, most of the groups are very young. These are a product of 2014. So at this time, it's only 2 years old phenomena for most cases. If there is funding, international funding and local funding from Iraq, we are seeing signs that Iraq is thinking of investing. Mr. Abadi announced that he will induct 40,000 Sunni militia members or 40,000 Sunni activists into the Iraqi forces, and even in Hashd al-Shabi first, and try to control them. So the crux of my argument is, the quicker it is done, the easier it is. The longer such groups retain independence and they're addicted, becomes difficult to incorporate them. In case of Taliban, for example. Same is the case with some of the Kashmir-focused groups in case of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Taliban, Mr. Ashraf Ghani and even Karzai had tried to induct some of the Taliban fighters into the Afghan forces, but it failed because Taliban had a long history. In Iraq, I would like to believe it is still possible to incorporate them into the National Guard. Thank you.
Make a few comments. This doesn't address your question. I'm more focused on preventing the situation from getting to that point. But just a few observations. One is that we're seeing these internationalization of conflicts becoming a much bigger problem in terms of having the external interventions that my colleague discussed, which has always been a problem in the Middle East as part of the colonial and post-colonial experience. But I think it's something that now we have to consider when we're looking for solutions, is things are not contained anymore. The conflicts aren't contained. And the fighters cross borders. So even if you are able to resolve something in one particular country or part of a country, then they migrate. The fighters are looking for new jobs. We saw that with the Afghan factor, where there's a concern that now you have a Syrian factor, which are going to then migrate to Libya. So I think that's just something that we have to consider in terms of the complexity of the situation, particularly of conflict. And then the second issue is, which is always often under discussed, is the reason why there is sectarianism in the first place, or the reason why you have identity politics that is played out in a violent way. And I think it comes down to distribution of resources and unfair lack of due process, lack of structures that ensure that resources are distributed not based on your identity, but based on some more objective factors. Because if, in fact, your group is not getting access to basic needs, whether it's jobs, food, shelter, or your group is being disparately or adversely treated by being selectively targeted for law enforcement and security, then you will then play identity politics. You will have to defend yourself, either as a tribe, as a sect, as a particular class. And again, I see sectarianism as a symptom of that problem. So we need to be thinking about how are resources distributed within each of these contexts, and how can we ensure they're not distributed in a way that is based on someone's identity. Because as long as they are, then the rational, self-preserving response is to be with your in-group and protect yourself, and it can quickly turn very violent.
Exactly, and we'll have time for, as you know, we got a late start. We'll have time for 2 more questions, and then we'll take a quick break and come back and continue. Yes, please.
Yes. My name is Juliet Adams, and I am a master's student at American University. And my question is based on the long-term strategy that is being suggested that the U.S. should use in terms of dealing with the Middle East. There is that emphasis that there should be less militarization. Now, based on what was said by the panel, you're asking for a shift in government and governance, in the foreign policy and how we deal with the Middle East. And there are certain models that government has, and as you know, government is very comfortable with. There's going to be a shift from Department of Defense to the State Department. Now, how do you suggest that the U.S. government goes about efficiently dealing with that shift so that it can meet some of the proposals that you have stated?
To me, I'll only talk about the Iraq reference in this case. I think it's very simple. It means more budget allocation for State Department. I've often heard from students and others in case of Afghanistan, when we use military to try to train police in Afghanistan, it will lead to militarization of police in Afghanistan. I'm just giving as an one example. So when you would say why we were tasking the US military to train police, because State Department or any other federal agency in the United States has no capacity to train police. So there's a small organization called INL which works with law enforcement in State Department, but they are not fully resourced. So that's one way to look at it. It depends on, in case of US specifically, it depends on capacity building even first within US to have trainers to do that kind of training, which will allow that shift. That's what I would say.
Other comments?
Well, I think you touch on a really interesting point, which is the bureaucratic infighting that we have here within the U.S. and oftentimes, and it's often disputes over resources. So we know this, those who have lived in D.C. for a while, is just as distribution of resources matter when we were talking about conflicts, they also matter within the various federal agencies in D.C. And so the Department of Defense is clearly getting many, many more resources, as is the Department of Homeland Security, for example, domestically. So one question or one challenge domestically is going to be addressing that issue, is how can we transfer those funds from agencies, whether it's Department of State or some other agency, that is not going to perpetuate this militarization of solving or attempting to solve these disputes. The other issue is relatedly, but it's domestic, is we're seeing that here as well in the U.S. I mean, there's literature that's burgeoning now about the militarization of the police, and many of the concerns about domestic security has been part of that. So again, part of this internationalization process is we have to solve that problem here if we want to also solve it abroad, which is that the police or the military or whoever is in charge of security is essentially the more superior agency that is qualified to address disputes, as opposed to using non-security solutions, whether it's social services, human development, international development, whatever the forum is that's different than the security context. So I think you bring up a good point, and it's something we need to address domestically as well.
Thank you. And one final question?
If I could make a quick logistical point, I don't know if I'm the only one that's freezing, but in case I'm not, maybe they
It
could do
is
something
freezing.
about the air conditioning, that'd be great. I'm Alexander Kravitz from Insight. Thank you to all the panelists for tremendously insightful presentations, and to the moderator, of course, as well. I have two questions for Professor Abbas. You mentioned that the PMF came from essentially three categories, let's say, the established armed wings, those organized by the leading mosques, and those that were Iranian-sponsored. You mentioned that in your estimate, there are about 85 to 100,000 and about 37 to 40 groups, and about 97% of them are Shia, if I took my notes correctly. The first question is, could you give us a breakdown of both in the numbers, the total numbers and the number of groups, of how many fall within the established armed wings, how many within that were formed by the leading mosque, and how many you consider to be Iranian-sponsored, and also some numbers in terms of how many of those militias are Sunni. And the second question is whether you would care to speculate about what role Sistani could play in thinking of a sort of a post-PMF period when, you know, ISIS is defeated and so forth, in terms of helping to put the genie back in the bottle, if you will. You know, given, as you explained to us, the fatwa that was really under, it was supposed, all these militias are supposed to be under the government. So how do you, since they exist, some might demobilize, but, you know, the previous question just talked about, you know, they integrate, but they really remain. So what role could Sistani play in terms of, like I said, putting the genie back in the bottle, if you will? Thank you.
Very important question. Very briefly, I'll take the Sistani question first. I think he's a huge role to play, but he's facing some challenge from Iran as well. What I had witnessed in Najaf and Karbala was that when Iranian pilgrims come, they come with their own big posters where Mr. Khamenei's picture is on the top and Mr. Sistani's picture is a little on the side, which Iraqis never liked it. They actually instructed that they should tore apart those pamphlets. So there's some tension from the Iran side to push back on Mr. Sistani's role. So there's that tension going on. But I think within Iraq, Mr. Sistani has huge impact still. Whatever he says to even Muqtada al-Sadr, who is kind of more independent now, cannot afford to just refuse what Mr. Sistani says. He will have a role. He's, I think, what I had the great opportunity to meet him twice. I cannot talk about what I heard there, but I have in my analysis, he's not very happy with how his fatwa was interpreted and how it led to this mobilization of forces, Hasht-e-Shabi, outside the control of the state. He's already working on trying to get them back in. And I can talk more about this afterwards. I think he has a positive role to play, and he's more constructive than many other religious players in similar theaters across the world. In terms of numbers, it's not very clear. Iran, for instance, out of these 37, is known to support 3 groups, but they are the biggest groups. Iranian sponsored groups are also surprisingly. Actually, I've heard from the field, they have not been more involved in human rights violations because they are better trained. And the perception is that Iranian-sponsored groups necessarily have more Iranians in those groups. No, they're all Iraqis. There are very few Iranians who are playing the role of trainers, actually. They're more. So even Iranian-sponsored groups are mostly Iraqis, but they are the most resourceful. The mosque groups or the ones supported by shrines are the smallest, but they are playing the most important role in safeguarding the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala. So they are extremely important. And in terms of the power and numbers, the second largest are which are the extensions of political parties. Mr. Muqtada al-Sadr, his group is playing the most important role in Samar. In Samar, that's very important shrine, and I saw all the pictures of Mr. Sadr in that area. So, and then he's trying to translate that power in Baghdad as well, that leading the protests. So the most powerful and resourceful are the Iranian-sponsored. The second ones are the local political groups, and the smallest in group in power and funding are the ones associated with the shrines. And the Sunni, very few. There is no independent group which is Sunni majority, but there are more groups which are linked with shrines, which have been actually asked by Sistani and others to welcome more Sunnis, and they are at the forefront of getting more Sunnis as well as Christians. Actually, there is one new Christian group that has come up. I don't know how much this is for PR, but they are also linked with to the best of my knowledge, with the shrine groups, those who have Sunnis. The overall Sunni participation is not more than 10 or at the most 15% at this time. And I'm not talking about the Kurd militias, but that's a slightly different phenomenon.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our audience, and thank you panelists. And I have been advised now we are running so late. We're skipping that coffee break that's been scheduled, but you do have 5 minutes to go out, grab coffee, bring it back in, and we'll commence the next panel immediately. Thank you so much.